Today, we are looking at one of the most terrifying unsolved murder cases that happened in the small town of Villisca, Iowa in 1912. Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and 2 visiting girls were brutally murdered in their home with an axe. The murderer was never caught, the crime scene was horrific, and the house that this took place in still stands today, claimed to be severely haunted. So without further ado, this is the Villisca Axe Murders, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. In 1912, Villisca, Iowa was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody. It had a population of just over 2,000 people, and it was a peaceful, tight-knit farming community. Life in Villisca was pretty simple. There was a very low crime rate, and it was the type of community where people rarely even locked their doors at night. Now, Josiah Moore and his wife, Sarah, were among the town's most respected citizens. Josiah, often called Joe, was a successful businessman. He worked in the implement business, selling, farm equipment, and was employed by a prominent local businessman named Frank Jones. Now, Joe and Sarah were seen as upstanding members of the community. Sarah was very active in the Presbyterian church and was also involved heavily in the local community. Together, Josiah and Sarah had 4 children: Herman, age 11, Catherine, age 10, Boyd, age 7, and Paul, age 5. On the evening of Sunday, June 9th, 1912, the Moore family had attended a Children's Day service at their church. It was a special event that Sarah had helped organize, and the whole family was involved. Along with them that night were 2 guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, ages 12 and 8. The Stillinger girls were friends of Catherine's and had, asked their parents to stay at the Moore's house after the church service. Their parents, without hesitation, gave them permission, thinking, that they were sending their daughters to probably one of the safest homes in the town. The Moore's house at 508 East 2nd Street was warm, full of life, and filled with the sound of children. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing gave away what would happen just hours later. After the evening church service, the Moore family, along with Lena and Ina Stillinger, returned to their house around 9:30 p.m. The children likely went to bed not too long after returning home, as they, were probably exhausted from the day's activities. By around 10 o'clock or so, the house was silent. But at some point after midnight, a man who was carrying an axe that actually belonged to Josiah Moore, murdered all 8 people in the house. The killer used the blunt end of the axe. He began with Josiah, striking him repeatedly in the head. It's claimed that the force of the blows was so extreme that it left deep gouges in the ceiling above the bed. Sarah Moore was next. She was killed in the same brutal manner as her husband. Then the killer moved from room to room, brutally murdering Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. But the violence didn't stop there. The killer then descended to the first floor guest bedroom, where of course Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping. The scene in this room was different. Lena was found in a twisted position with defensive wounds on her arms. She may have woken up and seen the killer, trying, to fight him off. By the end of it, all 8 people in the Moore house were murdered. But this case just gets even more disturbing because after the murders, the killer didn't, just leave the house. The killer covered every mirror in the house with clothing or sheets. He draped cloths over the heads of the victims, and as weird as it sounds, he left a 4-pound slab of bacon wrapped in cloth near the bodies of the Stillinger girls. There was also a bloody bowl of water that sat in the kitchen, possibly used by the killer to clean himself up. Now, one of the most chilling parts about this case is that the killer lingered. He didn't murder 8 people and go on the run. He took his time. Investigators believed that he may have stayed in the house for hours after the murders, possibly until sunrise. Now, it's also theorized that the killer made himself breakfast in the house before vanishing in the morning, unseen and unnoticed. No one in the town heard anything. There were no screams, there was no struggles, there was no broken glass or no forced entry. It was as if the killer had slipped in and out of the darkness, leaving only silence and death behind. On the morning of June 10th, 1912, a neighbor of the Moores named Mary Peckman began to grow, uneasy. She had seen no sign of the Moores all morning, which was highly unusual. There were no children playing outside. There were no chores being done, and there was no movement whatsoever from the, normally active household. By 8 a.m., Mary crossed the yard and, knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She tried to open the door, but it was locked, which, doesn't seem unusual. But like I said before, in the town of Villisca, it was normal to keep the doors unlocked. Understandably, Mary was alarmed and worried, so she called Josiah Moore's brother, Ross, who quickly arrived at the Moore's house with his spare key. The moment that Ross put the key in the lock and opened the door, he was hit by an eerie silence and sensed that, something was terribly wrong. As he stepped into the parlor and began calling out for the family, he moved towards the guest bedroom. As he opened the door, he was met with the blood-soaked bodies of the Stillinger sisters. Their skulls were crushed and their faces were unrecognizable. The sight was so terrifying that Ross immediately turned and ran out of the house. He called the town's peace officer, Hank Horton, who rushed to the scene. Upon arriving at the Moore's house, Horton entered the home and made a slow sweep through the rest of the house. What he found inside would become known as one of the most gruesome murder scenes in American history. Room by room, bed by bed, every single person inside was dead. Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena, and Ina, all brutally murdered with an axe. Word spread through Villisca like wildfire, and soon dozens of townspeople swarmed the property, desperate to see the horror for themselves. There was no crime scene tape and no preservation of evidence. Some townspeople entered the house and touched objects. One person even picked up the murder weapon. It's even said that another person took a small piece of Josiah's skull. The scene quickly descended into, utter chaos. Whatever clues the killer may have left behind were trampled, smudged, and erased by the crowd. The investigation was crippled from the start, and whoever had committed this horrifying act had already vanished without a trace. Like I just said, from the start, the whole entire investigation was a complete disaster. By the time law enforcement had arrived, the crime scene was contaminated. Townspeople walked throughout the house, they touched things, they picked up objects, they moved objects. It was a complete wreck. But despite the crime scene being a, train wreck, there were still a few strange clues that remained. Firstly, the bloody axe was found leaning against the wall in the guest room. Secondly, a kerosene lamp in each room had been altered so that the flame was dimmed, which suggested that the killer wanted just enough light to see, but not enough to be noticed. Thirdly, investigators found cigarette butts in the attic, which suggested that the killer may have hidden in the attic before striking. It's theorized that while the Moores were at church, the killer entered the house and waited in the attic until everybody in the house was asleep. This would explain why there was no sign of forced entry. And fourthly, every mirror and glass surface had been covered, as if the killer didn't want to see themselves. Either that, or the killer wanted the house to stay in darkness. Now, as the town reeled, attention quickly turned to finding a suspect. Over the following months, several people were accused, and while some were compelling, none were ever definitively tied to the crime. So let's take a quick look at some of the people that were accused of the crime. The first suspect was a man named Reverend George Kelly. Now, Reverend George Kelly is probably the most infamous suspect. He was an itinerant preacher who had been in Villisca the night of the murders. From most accounts, he was a strange man. He was described as being small, nervous, and eccentric. It's even rumored that he had a troubled past with erratic behavior and inappropriate sexual tendencies. Reverend George Kelly had attended the same church service as the Moore family that night. And what's, really shocking is that the very next morning, he boarded a train and reportedly told fellow passengers that 8 people had been murdered in Villisca, but this was before the bodies had ever been discovered. Now, a few years later, he actually confessed to the murders during an intense police interrogation. So now, boom, that's it, case closed. It was the creepy preacher who did it. Well, no, there was a problem. Reverend George Kelly was known for his mental instability, and his confession was full of contradictions. He later recanted, and his trial ended in a hung jury. He then had a second trial where he was acquitted. The second suspect is a man named Frank Jones, who we briefly mentioned earlier. Frank Jones was a prominent Villisca businessman and was also a state senator. Josiah Moore had once worked for Jones, but had left the company under bitter circumstances, and also had taken a major account with him. Some believed that Jones had a motive: revenge and professional jealousy. Rumors swirled that Frank Jones hired a hitman, possibly a man named William Mansfield, to carry out the murders. Which brings us to suspect number 3, William Mansfield. William Mansfield was a convicted axe murderer and suspected serial killer, and was connected to a series of similar brutal axe murders. He became a suspect in the Villisca axe murders after private detective James Wilkerson, working for the Burns Detective Agency, developed a theory that the Villisca killings were not isolated, but part of a larger series of murders, all committed by the same hand: Mansfield's. Wilkerson claimed that Mansfield was a cocaine addict, he was prone to sudden fits of violence, and that he had traveled by train between towns, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He was connected to the Burnham family murders in Blue Island, Illinois in 1911. Sarah Burnham, her daughter, and her husband were all killed with an axe as they slept. The killer used the blunt side of the axe, and the windows and mirrors were covered, as well as the door being locked from the inside. William Mansfield was also connected to the Dawson family murders in Paola, Kansas in 1912. This was a week before the Villisca axe murders. The entire Dawson family was murdered in their beds with an axe. Investigators on that case found a mirror that was covered, and it seemed as if the killer stayed in the house afterward, which, just like the other case, is eerily similar to the Villisca axe murders. And then there's another case that William Mansfield was connected to, and that is the Hudson family murders in Colorado Springs in 1911. Several family members were bludgeoned in their sleep. A bloody axe was found at the scene, and the curtains and windows were all covered. Again, the killer locked the doors from the inside before leaving. Now, despite this pattern, Mansfield was never officially charged with the Villisca axe murders. He had a strong alibi, supposedly being in Illinois at the time of the Villisca killings, and he had payroll records to back this up. Also, the authorities in Villisca were, deeply divided. Many believed that, Mansfield was the killer, while others believed that it was Reverend Kelly. But to this day, this case still remains cold, with no one ever being charged with the murders. Alright, so now that we know the 3 biggest suspects, let's quickly go over 5 of the most reasonable theories when it comes to the Villisca axe murders. The first theory being that whoever committed these murders was a local killer, and it was someone that the Moores knew. This theory was one of the earliest and most persistent theories. Many believe that the killer was someone close to the family, possibly even someone who had been inside their home before. Josiah Moore was a, successful businessman with a long list of friends as well as enemies. He had left his job at Frank Jones's implement store on bad terms, taking a valuable account with him, which was a move that caused public tension. Many think that someone from the town, either out of jealousy, revenge, or rage, carried out the murders. Now, this theory would make sense, but the only question I have is, why would the killer cover the mirrors? Why the ritualistic behavior? And why kill the whole entire family? And not to mention, why kill the Stillinger girls, who were just, guests? To me, nothing about this crime feels personal, which brings us to theory number 2. This theory being that whoever committed these murders was some type of serial killer that traveled by train. Perhaps this wasn't a crime committed by jealousy or revenge, but just one stop on a much darker journey. I mean, if we are being honest, the 1900s were a perfect time for a serial killer to operate undetected. Train lines connected small towns across the Midwest, and many of those towns had little or no police infrastructure. In the years surrounding Villisca, entire families were murdered in nearly identical fashion across Iowa, Kansas, Illinois, and Colorado, which were all located near major rail lines. Like I said before, in almost all of these cases, the victims were bludgeoned with the blunt side of an axe. The killer covered mirrors and windows. The killer also locked the doors from the inside, and he lingered at the scene. Not to mention, in all of these cases, the killer also left the murder weapon behind, which was, of course, an axe. It's almost as if the killer had a ritual, and Villisca fit his pattern perfectly. And again, this theory ties directly to William Mansfield. But even if it wasn't Mansfield, that means that there was another person who was riding the rails, striking randomly, and then just vanishing into the night. Now, the third theory is that it was indeed Reverend George Kelly who did it. Despite his acquittal, many still believe that Reverend George Kelly was the killer. He had a disturbing background, marked by mental instability, voyeuristic tendencies, and an obsession with young girls. He was also reportedly fascinated by the murders. Kelly attended the same church service as the Moore family, was in town that night, and oddly enough, left early the next morning. Later, he wrote letters to police and investigators obsessing over the case. He even confessed in an intense interrogation years later, but his confession was shaky and ultimately thrown out. So was Kelly a mentally ill man craving attention, or was he the killer, unable to, keep his guilt buried? I really don't know. Now, the fourth theory that, some investigators have proposed is that the killer's behavior went beyond the physical crime, that it had symbolic or ritualistic overtones. The covered mirrors, the, placement of the objects like the slab of bacon wrapped in cloth, the ritualistic posing of the victims. It's theorized that this could have been the work of someone practicing a form of dark ritual, or someone experiencing religious or, delusional visions. Now, there's not much evidence to support this theory, but let's be real here. This whole crime just has a super ritualistic feel. And then the last theory, which I actually think, could be very possible, is the theory that the reason that the case remains unsolved is because of how bad the local officials botched the investigation. Now, this theory just basically suggests that the case wasn't solved because, the killer was too clever. It was simply because the local officials just did a terrible job at managing the crime scene. I mean, you had the mob of townspeople trampling the crime scene. You had political bias protecting certain suspects, like Frank Jones, and, the lack of forensic tools at the time. It's possible that the truth was simply just lost in all of the chaos. And then, going a little bit deeper into this theory, some people suspect that there was a cover-up to protect someone powerful. In a town as small and, interconnected as Villisca, pointing fingers at the wrong person could mean political ruin, or even worse. All right, now, as I mentioned before, the Moore's house in Villisca, Iowa still stands today and is rumored by many to be pretty haunted. And going even further, the Villisca Axe Murder House is actually a tourist attraction and, kind of a historic landmark at this point. So in the late 1990s, the house was restored to its original 1912 condition. There's no plumbing, there's no electricity, and it's furnished to look just as it did the night of the murders. It's a paranormal attraction and a ghost hunting hotspot, and many who visit the house report unexplainable and, paranormal events. Throughout the years, many paranormal investigators have visited the Villisca Axe Murder House, and what some of the teams have, documented have been pretty creepy. Many people have described hearing disembodied voices, including the faint sound of children laughing or possibly even crying, which just gave me goosebumps. Investigators have captured EVPs believed to say things like, "Get out," "He's watching," and "Don't go upstairs." People have reported seeing full body apparitions, including a dark male figure that reportedly lingers near the attic. And there have been footsteps reported in empty rooms, doors that close by themselves, and, lights turning on and off, despite there being no electricity in the house. There have also been reports of cold spots, the smell of gunpowder, and a lingering sense of dread, especially in the children's room. Allegedly, some guests have also been scratched, punched, or suddenly overcome with intense sadness or nausea. Now, there are two areas in the house that are said to be especially active. The first one being the children's room, where, guests have placed toys and balls in hopes of communicating with the spirits of Lena and Ines Dillinger. Visitors have claimed to hear the toys moving on their own, or seen the toys appear in different places later in the night. And two, the attic, which was believed to be where the killer hid until everyone was asleep. Multiple investigators have said the attic gives off a crushing, angry energy, with some refusing to even, enter the attic altogether. Now, crazy enough, you can actually rent the Villisca Axe Murder House overnight. I'm pretty sure it's like $600 or something to stay there for a night, or something like that. But anyways, this has been the story of the Villisca axe murders, which, in my opinion, is one of the most terrifying unsolved murder cases of all time. Let me know down in the comments, what you guys thought of the video, as well as who you guys think committed the murders, or, what theories you guys may have. Anyways, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and peace out.